The morning of September 15th, 1847, dawned blood-red over the New Mexico territory, painting the desert landscape in shades of crimson and gold that promised another scorching day. Thomas Merik stood on the wooden porch of his modest adobe farmhouse, watching the sunrise with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found peace in honest work and simple living. At 43, he was still strong. Despite the silver threads weaving through his brown hair, his calloused hands bearing testimony to 8 years of coaxing life from the stubborn desert soil. Inside the house, his 12-year-old daughter Lily was preparing breakfast, her movements efficient and practiced despite her small stature. She had learned self-sufficiency in the harsh years since her mother Sarah had died of consumption, leaving father and daughter to face the challenges of frontier life together. The farmhouse was sparse, but meticulously clean with handmade furniture, crafted by Thomas's own hands, and a few treasured possessions that had survived the arduous journey west from Missouri. "Papa," Lily called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the slight drawl common to frontier children. "The biscuits are ready and the coffee's done. Come eat before everything gets cold." Thomas smiled and stepped inside his worn leather boots, clicking softly on the wooden floor he had laid plank by plank during their first winter in the territory. The kitchen was warm and filled with the comforting aromas of fresh bread and strong coffee, a haven of domesticity in the harsh landscape that surrounded them. "You're getting too good at this," he said, settling into his chair at the small pine table that served as both dining surface and Lily's desk for her lessons. "Soon, you'll be ready to run a household of your own." I'm only 12, Papa," Lily replied with a laugh that reminded Thomas painfully of his late wife pouring coffee from the blue enamel pot that had been Sarah's pride and joy. "I'm not ready for anything but helping you with the farm and maybe learning to read better." Thomas studied his daughter's face, noting the way her dark eyes sparkled with intelligence and quiet determination. She had inherited her mother's quick wit and gentle nature. But there was something else there, a strength that reminded him of the pioneers who had first carved civilization from this unforgiving wilderness. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said quietly, reaching across the table to squeeze her small hand. "She always said you had the makings of something special, something important." Lily's cheeks flushed with pleasure at the praise, and for a moment her expression softened with the memory of the woman who had shaped her earliest years. Sarah Merrick had been a schoolteacher back in Missouri, a woman of education and refinement who had chosen to follow her husband into the unknown territories of the West. She had died when Lily was 7, succumbing to the lung fever that claimed so many frontier women, but not before instilling in her daughter a love of learning and an unshakable belief in the importance of truth and justice. She used to say that sometimes the hardest thing in the world is to do what's right when everyone else is doing what's wrong. Lily said softly, her voice carrying the weight of a lesson learned at her mother's deathbed. "But that's exactly when it matters most." Thomas knotted his throat tight with emotion. "She was a wise woman, your mother. Wiser than most men I've known." Their quiet morning was interrupted by the sound of galloping horses approaching the farmhouse, the rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth, carrying an unmistakable note of urgency. Both father and daughter looked up in alarm, and their frontier instincts immediately alert to potential danger. "Stay inside," Thomas commanded, rising from his chair and reaching for the rifle that hung above the stone fireplace. "Don't come out no matter what happens, you understand me." Through the window, they could see a group of Apache warriors approaching the farmhouse, their bronze faces painted with the resolute expressions of men engaged in serious business. At their head rode a distinguished older man with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of a natural leader, Chief Neshoba Red Elk, whose reputation for wisdom and fairness was known throughout the territory. Thomas stepped onto the porch, his rifle held ready, but not threatening. He had lived in Apache territory long enough to understand that showing fear or aggression would only escalate a dangerous situation into something potentially deadly. "Chief Neshoba," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at his stomach like acid. "What brings you to my farm this morning?" The Apache chief dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his entire life on horseback. His dark eyes, weathered by decades of sun and wind, studied Thomas with the careful attention of someone trying to read the truth written in another man's face. "Thomas Merik." Neshoba said, his English heavily accented but precise and measured. "Last night, white men came to the ranch of Hoyt Sullivan. They killed 6 ranch hands and stole 300 head of cattle. We found you wandering near the scene at dawn, investigating the sounds of gunfire." Thomas felt his heart sink as he realized the implications of the chief's words. The Double S Ranch was Sullivan's pride and joy, the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, and an attack on it would bring swift and brutal retaliation from the territorial authorities. "I heard gunshots in the night," Thomas said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man who understood that his life might depend on them. "And the sound of cattle moving in large numbers. I went to investigate, thinking perhaps rustlers were threatening our neighbors." "Perhaps," Neshoba replied, his tone carefully non-committal. "But your people will say that Apache warriors stole the cattle. They will demand revenge against my people. They will not care about the truth, only about their anger." "What truth?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer and dreaded hearing it confirmed. "What is that white men were involved in the raid?" Neshoba said simply, his voice carrying the weight of long experience with such matters. "Evidence was left behind at the scene, a knife with a carved handle, a piece of torn cloth boot prints in the soft earth. Someone wants your people to blame mine for this crime." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "And you think I was part of it? I think you were in the wrong place at the wrong time." Neshoba replied, his weathered face showing a trace of sympathy. "But my people are not safe, while yours believe we are responsible for the deaths of 6 men. You will come with us until the truth is known and justice can be served." Before Thomas could respond, 4 Apache warriors dismounted and approached the porch with purposeful strides. They were young men, their faces painted with the traditional markings of their warrior, calling their hands steady and confident on their weapons. Thomas knew that resistance would be futile and probably fatal. "Let me say goodbye to my daughter," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Neshoba nodded, his weathered face showing genuine sympathy. "Be quick about it. We have far to travel before the sun grows hot, and there are many dangers on the trail." Thomas stepped back into the house, where Lily was pressed against the kitchen window, her face pale with terror, as she watched the armed men waiting outside. When she saw her father, she ran into his arms, her small body trembling with fear. "Papa, what's happening?" she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. "Why are they here? What do they want?" "I have to go with them for a while," Thomas said, fighting to keep his voice steady and reassuring. "There's been trouble at the Sullivan Ranch last night, and they need to ask me some questions about what I might have seen or heard." "But you didn't do anything wrong," Lily protested, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. "You've never hurt anyone in your whole life." "I know that, and you know that," Thomas replied, stroking her hair with gentle fingers. "But sometimes being innocent isn't enough in this world. Sometimes you have to prove it, and that takes time." He held her close for a moment longer, breathing in the scent of her hair and trying to memorize the feel of her small body against his chest. The knowledge that he might never see her again was almost too much to bear. "And listen to me carefully, Lily," he said, his voice urgent. "If I'm not back by nightfall, go to the Hendersons in town. Tell them what happened here. They'll take care of you until this is all sorted out." "I don't want to go to the Hendersons," Lily said, her voice breaking with emotion. I want to stay here and wait for you. I want to go with you." "You can't come with me," Thomas said firmly, though his heart was breaking at the words. "This is something I have to face alone. But I promise you, I'll do everything in my power to come back to you. Do you believe me?" Lily looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her. 12 years' eyes that had seen too much hardship and loss for someone so young. "I believe you, Papa. But what if they don't let you come back? What if something terrible happens?" Thomas felt his heart shatter at the question, but he forced himself to smile with confidence he didn't feel. "Then you'll have to be strong enough for both of us. You'll have to remember everything your mother taught you about standing up for what's right. Can you do that for me?" "I'll try," Lily whispered, and Thomas knew with absolute certainty that she would. She had always been stronger than her years, more resilient than children should ever have to be. The Apache warriors were waiting with obvious impatience. When Thomas stepped back onto the porch, their faces impassive, but their eyes alert to every sound and movement. Chief Neshoba had remounted his horse and was studying the eastern horizon with the careful attention of a man who knew that danger could approach from any direction. "We go now," the chief said simply, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes for all of us." Thomas mounted the horse they had brought for him, his hands shaking slightly as he took the leather reins. He had ridden with Apache before during the brief periods of peace that occasionally blessed the territory, but never as a prisoner. The knowledge that his life hung in the balance made every sound, every movement seem fraught with deadly significance. As they rode away from the farm, Thomas looked back to see Lily standing on the porch, her small figure dwarfed by the vastness of the desert landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. She raised her hand in a gesture that might have been a wave or a blessing, and he felt his heart constrict with fear for her safety and future. 20 miles away in the dusty streets of Copper Creek, word of the raid on the Double S Ranch was spreading like wildfire through the small frontier town. The Silver Dollar Saloon was packed with angry men, their faces flushed with whiskey and righteous indignation, their voices raised in demands for immediate and decisive action. 6 good men dead. Hoyt Sullivan was declaring from his position at the bar, his voice carrying easily over the crowd and commanding their complete attention. "Shot down like dogs while they tried to protect my cattle from thieving savages. And for what so a bunch of lazy Apache could steal what they were too worthless to raise themselves?" Sullivan was a man who commanded attention wherever he went, a natural leader who had built his position through a combination of hard work, shrewd business dealing, and ruthless elimination of anyone who stood in his way. At 45, he had accumulated the largest ranch in the territory, controlling thousands of acres of prime grazing land and water rights that made him one of the most powerful men in the region. His broad shoulders and carefully groomed beard gave him the appearance of a successful businessman, but his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had learned to take what he wanted without regard for the consequences. "What are you going to do about it?" Hoyt called out Jim Henderson, the owner of the town's general store, his voice tight with worry. "We can't let them think they can attack us without facing serious consequences." "I'm going to get my cattle back." Sullivan replied, his voice hard with determination and barely controlled rage. "And I'm going to make sure the men who killed my ranch hands pay for their crimes with their lives." "How do you know for certain it was Apache?" asked a cautious voice from the back of the crowd. Could have been Mexican rustlers coming up from the south, or even white outlaws from one of the other territories. Sullivan's face darkened with anger at the suggestion, and he pulled a leather pouch from his coat with dramatic flourish. "Because I found evidence," he said, his voice rising with passion. "Hard evidence that proves exactly who was responsible for this massacre." He dumped the contents of the pouch onto the bar with a loud clatter, and the crowd pressed forward eagerly to examine what he had discovered. There was a hunting knife, with a carved bone handle, its blade stained with what appeared to be dried blood. A piece of blue calico cloth, torn and dirty, fluttered in the breeze from the open door. And most damning of all, a brass button gleamed in the lamplight like an accusation. "This knife belongs to Thomas Merik." Sullivan declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Every man in this room has seen him use it for everything from cutting rope to skinning game. And this cloth came from his shirt, the same blue calico one he wore to town just last week when he came to argue with me about water rights." The crowd murmured with growing excitement and anger, their voices rising as they absorbed the implications of Sullivan's evidence. Thomas Merik had always been something of an outsider in Copper Creek, a quiet man who kept to himself and his small farm on the outskirts of town, rarely participating in the social life of the community. But Tom's not a killer. Henderson protested, his voice uncertain and worried. "He's always been a peaceful man, good to his neighbors, never caused any trouble." "Peaceful men don't scout for Apache raiding parties." Sullivan replied coldly, his eyes flashing with anger. "But desperate men do. Men who need money badly, men who have grudges against their more successful neighbors." "What grudge could Tom Merik possibly have against you?" asked Jake Morrison, a young cowboy who worked for Sullivan, but still retained some independence of thought. He's always seemed like a decent enough fellow. Sullivan's eyes narrowed as he remembered the confrontation he had carefully orchestrated just the previous week, setting the stage for exactly this moment. "He came to me about water rights," he said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Said I was damming the creek upstream from his farm, cutting off his water supply during the growing season, accused me of trying to force him off his land, and—" Morrison prompted, sensing there was more to the story. "And he got angry when I told him to take me to court if he thought he could prove it." Sullivan continued, his voice growing louder and more dramatic. "Started talking about how men like me were destroying the territory, taking what we wanted without regard for the small farmers who'd been here first. Said he wouldn't stand for it much longer, that something had to be done." "That doesn't sound like Tom," Henderson said doubtfully. "He's not the type to make threats." "Maybe you don't know him as well as you think," Sullivan shot back. "Maybe none of us do. All I know is that he came to my ranch last week angry as a hornet and told me I'd regret challenging him. Said he'd find a way to make me pay for what I was doing to his farm." The crowd was growing more agitated by the moment, their voices rising in anger and their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. This was exactly the reaction Sullivan had hoped for, mob violence directed at a convenient scapegoat who could never defend himself effectively. "So what do we do about it?" Henderson asked, his voice shaking with emotion. "We can't just let him get away with helping to murder 6 innocent men. We ride to the Apache camp." Sullivan declared, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We demand they turn over Thomas Merik for proper justice, and if they refuse to cooperate, we take him by force." "That could start a war," Morrison said quietly, his young face creased with worry. "A war that could get a lot of people killed." "Then so be it," Sullivan replied, his voice ringing with false righteousness. "Sometimes a man has to fight for what's right, even when the odds are against him. Sometimes justice demands a price in blood." Sheriff Porter, who had been standing quietly in the corner, nursing a glass of whiskey and trying to avoid involvement, finally spoke up with obvious reluctance. "I can't authorize a lynching, Hoyt. You know that. If you want Merik brought to justice, it has to be done according to the law." Sullivan turned to face the sheriff, his eyes cold with barely concealed contempt. "According to the law," he said mockingly. "You mean like the legal system that lets Apache raid our ranches and steal our cattle without consequences? You mean like the legal system that protects killers and thieves while honest men suffer and die. Porter's face flushed with embarrassment and anger, but he knew better than to challenge Sullivan directly. The rancher held too much power in the territory, controlled too many votes, owned too many IOUs from gambling debts and business deals. Porter's own position depended on Sullivan's continued support. "I'm just saying we need to be careful about how we handle this," he said weakly. "We don't want to do anything that might cause more trouble later. Careful is what got 6 of my men killed." Sullivan replied, his voice rising with manufactured passion. "Careful is what lets murderers and thieves operate with impunity. I say we've been careful long enough. Who's with me?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. 25 men stepped forward, their faces set with grim determination, their hands already reaching for their weapons. These were hard men shaped by the brutal realities of frontier life, and they had heard enough talk about justice and legality. They wanted action, and they wanted it now. "We ride at dawn." Sullivan announced, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "Be ready for a fight, because the Apache won't give him up without one. Bring plenty of ammunition and supplies for several days on the trail." As the crowd began to disperse, Sullivan caught sight of a small figure pressed against the window of the general store, listening intently to every word. It was Lily Merrick, her face pale with terror, as she absorbed the implications of what she had heard. For a moment their eyes met across the dusty street, and Sullivan felt a brief flicker of something that might have been conscience. Then the moment passed, and he turned away with cold calculation. The girl was unfortunate collateral damage in a larger plan, but Sullivan had learned long ago that sentimental feelings were a luxury he couldn't afford. The water rights to Thomas Merik's farm were worth more than all the conscience in the world, and he would not be deterred by the tears of a child. Lily crept away from the window, her heart pounding with fear and growing determination. She had heard enough to understand that her father was in mortal danger, that the men of Copper Creek were preparing to ride out and demand his life from the Apache who held him. She had to find a way to warn him, to help him, to save him from the mob that was already forming in the streets. But she was just a 12-year-old girl, and the men who wanted her father dead were armed and dangerous. What could she possibly do against such overwhelming odds? That night, as the town buzzed with preparations for war, Lily made the most important decision of her young life. She couldn't save her father by confronting the mob directly, but she could follow them to wherever they were taking him. She could bear witness to what happened, and maybe she could find a way to help when the moment came. The supply wagon that would follow Sullivan's posse was being loaded with ammunition, food, and medical supplies for what might be a long and dangerous campaign. The teamster, a grizzled old man named Pete Carson, was making his final preparations when Lily slipped out of the Henderson house where she had been staying and hid herself beneath the canvas tarp that covered the wagon bed. The journey that followed was a nightmare of heat, thirst, and bone-jarring motion that tested the limits of her young endurance. During the day, she lay motionless beneath the heavy canvas, breathing the stifling air and trying not to cry out when the wagon hit rocks or potholes. The temperature under the tarp must have reached 120 degrees, and more than once she thought she might die from the heat and suffocation. But worse than the physical discomfort was the constant fear of discovery. If Carson found her, she would be sent back to town before she could help her father. If Sullivan's men found her, she might be killed as an inconvenient witness to their plans. At night, when the posse made camp, Lily would wait until the men were asleep before slipping out to steal water from their canteens and food from their saddlebags. She took only small amounts, careful not to take enough to be missed. But even these meager rations were barely enough to keep her alive. By the second day, her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, and her small body was racked with fever. She had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and her clothes hung loose on her diminished frame. But still she pressed on, driven by memories of her father's gentle hands and patient voice. and by the dying words of her mother about the importance of doing what was right. As she lay beneath the canvas, struggling to breathe in the stifling heat, Lily found herself thinking about Sarah Merrick's final days. Her mother had wasted away slowly, her lungs filled with fluid, her body consumed by the fever that claimed so many frontier women. But even in her delirium, Sarah had insisted on teaching her daughter important lessons about courage and justice. Sometimes, her mother had whispered during one of their last conversations, her voice barely audible above the rattling in her chest. The hardest thing in the world is to stand up for what's right when everyone else is doing what's wrong. But that's exactly when it matters most, when good people have to find the strength to speak the truth. But what if I'm too small? Lily had asked her 7-year-old mind, struggling to understand. What if I'm not strong enough? Strength isn't about size. Sarah had replied, her fevered eyes burning with intensity. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice for the people you love. It's about refusing to be silent when silence would be easier. The words echoed in Lily's mind as she endured the agony of the desert crossing, giving her strength when her body wanted to collapse. She was doing what her mother had taught her, standing up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. On the third day, when the supply wagon could go no farther into the rocky terrain, Lily continued on foot. She followed the dust cloud raised by the horses, staying far enough behind to avoid detection, but close enough to maintain visual contact. Her feet protected only by thin leather boots, meant for farm work rather than desert travel, soon began to blister and bleed. The landscape through which she traveled was harsh and unforgiving, a testament to the brutal power of wind and water over countless centuries. Red sandstone cliffs rose like ancient monuments against the brilliant blue sky, their surfaces carved into fantastic shapes by the elements. Scrub brush and cacti dotted the desert floor, their thorns catching at her dress and skin, leaving her arms and legs striped with shallow cuts that burned in the dry air. As she walked, Lily found herself drawing strength from the memory of her parents' love and the lessons they had taught her. Her father's gentle wisdom, her mother's fierce determination to do what was right, regardless of the cost, these were the foundations upon which she would build her courage. Meanwhile, at the Apache camp hidden in the Rocky Hills, Chief Neshoba Red Elk was having his own struggles with questions of right and wrong. The council fire burned low as he met with his most trusted warriors, their faces grave with the weight of the decisions they faced. "The white men will come for him," said Running Bear, one of Neshoba's most experienced lieutenants, his scarred face reflecting decades of conflict. "They will demand his blood to satisfy their anger, and they will not accept our word that he is innocent. No. And if we refuse to hand him over?" asked Grey Wolf, another veteran warrior whose wisdom was respected throughout the tribe. "They will say we protect killers and thieves. They will use it as justification to drive us from our lands and break the treaties we have made." Neshoba stared into the flames, his weathered face reflecting the accumulated wisdom of his 62 years. He had seen too much conflict, too much bloodshed, too much injustice to make hasty decisions. The white man, Thomas Merik, did not kill those ranch hands. He said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "I have examined the evidence carefully. It was placed too carefully, too conveniently. Someone wants us to be blamed for this crime." "Then who is the real killer?" Running Bear asked, his voice tight with anger. "Who benefits from war between our peoples? The men who want our land." Neshoba replied, his eyes never leaving the fire. "Men who would profit from driving us away from the territories we have called home for generations. Men who see opportunity in hatred and violence between red and white." The warriors murmured among themselves, their voices low but intense. They had all witnessed the steady encroachment of white settlers onto their traditional hunting grounds, had watched as their people were pushed into smaller and smaller areas of increasingly marginal land. The idea that someone might be deliberately fomenting conflict for personal gain was not difficult to believe. "What do you propose we do?" Grey Wolf asked, his voice carrying the weight of long experience. "Now we wait." Neshoba said, his voice firm with resolve. "We keep the white man safe until the truth can be discovered and justice can be served. And we prepare for whatever comes, because I fear this matter will not be resolved easily." "The white men will not accept delay," Running Bear warned. "They will come with guns and anger, demanding immediate satisfaction. Then we will be ready for them," Neshoba replied. "But we will not spill innocent blood, and we will not allow innocent blood to be spilled while we have the power to prevent it." Thomas Merik sat in the center of the Apache camp, his hands bound with leather thongs, but his treatment otherwise respectful. The warriors had fed him and given him water, recognizing that he was a man caught in circumstances beyond his control. But he could see the tension in their faces, could feel the weight of the decision they faced. "Chief Neshoba," he said as the Apache leader approached after the council meeting, "I want you to know that I didn't kill those men. I couldn't kill anyone, not even to save my own life. It's not in my nature." Neshoba studied him with dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul eyes that had learned to read the truth in men's hearts through decades of leadership. "I believe you speak the truth," he said finally, his voice carrying quiet conviction. "But belief alone is not enough. We need proof that will convince your people." "What kind of proof?" Thomas asked, his voice heavy with despair. "The kind that will save both your life and the lives of my people," Neshoba replied. "The kind that will show your people who their real enemy is and why this crime was committed." As the third day dawned, Sullivan's posse was making its final approach to the Apache camp. The men were hot, tired, and angry, their faces set with the grim determination of men who had convinced themselves that violence was the only solution to their problems. They had ridden hard through the desert, driven by Sullivan's promises of justice and revenge. "Remember," Sullivan called out as they crested the final ridge before the camp, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "We're here for justice. The Apache have harbored a killer, and we mean to take him back for proper trial and punishment." "What if they refuse to cooperate?" asked one of the men, his voice tight with nervousness. "Then we take him by force," Sullivan replied coldly, his hand resting on his gun. "We didn't come all this way to be turned back by a bunch of savages who don't understand civilized law." Jake Morrison, riding near the back of the group, felt his stomach clench with unease. He had known Thomas Merik for years, had bought supplies from him, had even helped him with his harvest one year when illness had left him short-handed. The idea that such a gentle man could be a killer and traitor seemed impossible to accept. But Morrison was young, and he had been raised to respect authority and follow orders. Sullivan was his employer, a successful and powerful man who surely knew more about such matters than a simple cowboy. If Sullivan said Merik was guilty, then he must be guilty. Still, as they approached the Apache camp, Morrison found himself hoping that the whole matter could be resolved peacefully. He had seen enough violence in his 22 years to know that it rarely solved anything and always left scars that never fully healed. The camp was situated in a natural amphitheater, carved from red sandstone by countless centuries of wind and water, its walls rising like the seats of some ancient arena. The Apache had chosen their position well. It was defensible with fresh water, from a hidden spring and multiple escape routes, if the situation deteriorated into open warfare. As Sullivan's posse approached Apache, warriors emerged from their lodges and took defensive positions among the rocks. They moved with the fluid grace of men who had spent their lives fighting for survival, their weapons ready, but not immediately threatening. The tension in the air was palpable, like the feeling before a thunderstorm. Chief Neshoba Red Elk stood in the center of the camp, his silver-streaked hair catching the morning sunlight, his weathered face calm, despite the dangerous situation developing around him. Behind him, Thomas Merik stood on a natural rocky platform, a rope around his neck and his hands bound behind his back. The makeshift gallows had been constructed from a dead tree, and a length of hemp rope, a grim reminder of frontier justice. "That's far enough," Neshoba called out as the posse approached, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "State your business here, and then be gone from our lands." Sullivan dismounted and strode forward, his face flushed with anger and righteous determination. "We've come for Thomas Merik," he declared, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "He's wanted for murder and cattle theft. Turn him over to us and we'll leave peacefully." "And if we refuse?" Neshoba asked, his voice calm, but carrying an undertone of steel. "Then we'll take him by force," Sullivan replied, his hand moving to his gun. "We have 30 men all armed and ready to fight. You're outnumbered and outgunned." "The numbers are not everything in battle," Neshoba said simply, his voice carrying the wisdom of long experience. "Sometimes right is more important than might. Sometimes justice matters more than strength." "Justice." Sullivan laughed bitterly, his voice filled with false outrage. "You're talking about justice while you harbor a killer. 6 good men are dead because of him. Their families deserve satisfaction for their loss." "Justice, yes," Neshoba agreed, his voice steady. "But first, truth. How do you know with certainty that this man is guilty of the crimes you accuse him of?" Sullivan reached into his saddlebag and withdrew the leather pouch containing the evidence, his movements dramatic and calculated. "Because I found hard proof," he said, dumping the contents onto the ground with a loud clatter. His knife, his shirt, his button, all found at the scene of the crime. The Apache warriors murmured among themselves as they studied the evidence, their dark eyes suspicious and alert. They had learned through bitter experience to be wary of white man's justice, which often seemed to depend more on convenience than truth. "This proves he was present at the location," Neshoba said carefully, his voice measured. "But it does not prove he killed your men or stole your cattle." "It's enough evidence for me," Sullivan replied, his voice hard with finality. "And it's enough for any jury in the territory. He's going to hang Chief. The only question is whether it happens here or in town." That was when Lily Merrick burst from her hiding place among the rocks, her small figure stumbling into the center of the confrontation with desperate urgency. She was barely recognizable. Her dress was torn and filthy, her face streaked with dust and tears, her dark hair matted with sweat and blood from the thorns that had torn at her during her desperate 3-day journey through the desert. "Stop!" she cried, her voice cracking with exhaustion and terror. "Please, you have to stop." Every gun in the canyon swung toward her, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through stone and the harsh breathing of men balanced on the knife's edge of violence. Lily fell to her knees in the dust, her small body shaking with exhaustion and fear. She had traveled 3 days through hell to reach this moment, had risked everything to save her father's life. Now faced with 30 armed men and the very real possibility of immediate death, she somehow found the courage to speak. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her own heart. "Let me speak for my father. Let me tell you the truth." Chief Neshoba Red Elk studied the trembling girl with eyes that had seen too much sorrow and too much injustice in his long life. There was something in her desperate courage that reminded him painfully of his own daughter, who had died of fever 5 years earlier at almost the same age. The memory of that loss and the recognition of genuine bravery in the face of overwhelming odds moved him deeply. "Let her speak," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. The words seemed to break the spell of impending violence that had gripped the canyon. Men on both sides lowered their weapons slightly, their attention focused on the small figure kneeling in the dust between them. "You shouldn't be here, girl." Sullivan said, his voice showing more emotion than he had intended. "This is no place for a child. This is men's business. It's no place for murder either." Lily replied, struggling to her feet with the quick resilience of youth. "And that's what you're planning, isn't it? You're going to hang my father without a trial, without real proof, without even listening to what he has to say." "We have proof," Sullivan said, gesturing toward the evidence scattered on the ground. "Your father's knife, his shirt, his button, all found at the scene of the crime. What more do you need?" Lily stepped closer, her young eyes studying the items with the kind of attention to detail that surprised the watching men. She had grown up in a world where every tool was precious and well-maintained, where the smallest details often meant the difference between success and failure, between life and death. That's not his knife," she said finally, her voice carrying across the canyon with surprising authority and absolute certainty. "What did you say?" Sullivan's face darkened with anger and something that might have been fear. "I said that's not his knife." Lily repeated, her voice growing stronger with each word. "My father's knife has a deep nick in the blade from when he was clearing rocks from our cornfield last spring. I was there when it happened. He was so upset because it was his grandfather's knife passed down through 3 generations of our family." She pointed to the weapon on the ground, her small fingers steady despite her fear. "That blade is perfect, no chips, no nicks, no wear marks from years of use. It's almost brand new. And the handle?" She moved closer, her finger tracing the carved bone surface. "My father's knife has a crack right here from when he dropped it while skinning a deer 2 winters ago. This handle is completely unmarked." The observation sent a murmur of uncertainty through both groups of men. Several of the townspeople shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, their confidence in the evidence beginning to waver. Jake Morrison dismounted and knelt beside the knife, examining it closely, with the practiced eye of someone who worked with tools every day. "She's right," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "This knife shows no signs of long use or wear. If it belonged to her father, it would show the marks of daily use." "Knives can be sharpened," Sullivan said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "The nicks can be ground out, the blade made smooth again." "Not that completely," Lily replied with growing confidence. "And you can't repair a crack in bone that way. Besides, look at this cloth." She picked up the piece of blue calico, holding it up to the light. This wasn't torn from a shirt during a fight or while running through brush. Look at the edges, they're too clean, too straight. This was cut with scissors and placed there deliberately. Sheriff Porter, who had been silent during most of the confrontation, finally spoke up with obvious reluctance. "How can you be so sure about that child?" "Because I helped my father with his mending," Lily said simply, her voice carrying the ring of truth. "I know what cloth looks like when it's torn accidentally by thorns or branches, and I know what it looks like when it's cut deliberately with scissors. This was cut." She held the cloth closer to her face, sniffing it carefully. "And there's something else. This smells like fresh ink, like it was marked recently. The threads are too clean, too new looking. If this had been torn from my father's shirt during a fight, it would be stained with dirt and sweat, not just dust." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the Apache warriors who had been watching the proceedings with stoic patience seemed to lean forward with growing interest. The small girl was systematically destroying the evidence that would have condemned her father to death. "You're grasping at straws," Sullivan said, but his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty and growing desperation. "Even if you question the knife and cloth, the fact remains that your father was found at the scene of the crime. That's not easily explained away. He was investigating gunshots." Lily replied quickly, her voice gaining strength. "He heard shooting and cattle moving at night, and he went to see if our neighbors needed help. That's the kind of man he is, someone who helps others in trouble, not someone who kills them for money." "Then answer this," Sullivan demanded, his voice rising with challenge. "If your father didn't help steal those cattle, where are they now? 300 head of prime beef don't just disappear into thin air." "That's a very good question," Lily said, her voice taking on a note of challenge. "And here's another one. If my father was paid for his part in the raid, where's the money?" "We're poor, Mr. Sullivan. We live on corn and beans and whatever vegetables we can grow in that rocky soil. Our cabin has one room, our barn is falling down. If my father had been paid for betraying your ranch, wouldn't there be some sign of sudden wealth?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. It was a logical point, one that several of Sullivan's men were already considering with growing unease. If Merik had been paid for his part in the raid, there should be some evidence of money or new possessions. "He could have hidden it," Sullivan said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Where?" Lily asked, her voice growing bolder. "In our one-room cabin where we eat and sleep, in the barn that's falling down around our ears, in the fields where we grow our food. There's nowhere to hide anything substantial on our farm, Mr. Sullivan. You know that because you've been there." The admission slipped out before Sullivan could stop it, and several of his men looked at him with new suspicion. Why would Sullivan have visited the Merik farm if he barely knew the family? I was surveying the water rights," Sullivan said quickly, his face flushing with anger. "Making sure the creek boundaries were properly marked according to the territorial surveys." "Were they properly marked?" Lily asked innocently, her young voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Or were you trying to dam the creek upstream from our farm to cut off our water supply?" Sullivan's face turned red with rage. "That's none of your business, girl. It is when you're using it as a motive for murder," Lily replied boldly. "You told the men in town that my father was angry about water rights, that he threatened you last week. But you didn't mention that you were the one cutting off his water supply in the middle of the growing season." Chief Neshoba, who had been listening to the exchange with growing interest, stepped forward. "Tell me about this water dispute," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to getting truthful answers. "It's nothing important," Sullivan said quickly, his voice tight with nervousness. "Just a minor business disagreement between neighbors." "Business disagreements don't usually end with hangings," Neshoba observed dryly. "What exactly did you do to anger this man?" Thomas Merik, who had been silent during most of the confrontation, finally spoke up. "He dammed the creek that runs through my land," he said, his voice hoarse from the rope around his neck. "Cut off my water supply right in the middle of the growing season. When I asked him to remove the dam, he said if I didn't like it, I could take him to court." "And could you afford to do that?" Neshoba asked, his voice carefully neutral. "On what money?" Thomas replied bitterly. "I'm a poor farmer, Chief. I can't afford lawyers to fight rich men who want to steal my land." "So you threatened him in return?" Neshoba's voice carried no judgment, only curiosity. "I told him it wasn't right," Thomas said, his voice gaining strength. "That there were laws about water rights and that he couldn't just take what he wanted. I said if he didn't restore the water flow, I'd find a way to stop him legally." "Ah," Neshoba said, his voice showing understanding. "And this gave him reason to believe you might seek revenge through other means. It gave him an excuse," Lily said, her young voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "An excuse to blame my father for a crime he didn't commit. An excuse to get him hanged so he could steal our farm." Sullivan's face had gone pale, and his hands were visibly shaking as he reached for his gun. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising with desperation. We're listening to the wild theories of a child instead of focusing on the hard evidence of 6 dead men. What evidence? Lily asked boldly, her fear beginning to be replaced by righteous anger. A knife that isn't his cloth, that was cut, not torn. The fact that he was found investigating a crime instead of running from it. The evidence of dead men. Sullivan snarled, his control beginning to slip. Men who died because your father led Apache raiders to my ranch and showed them exactly where to strike. Did he? The voice came from the rocky bluffs above the canyon, and every head turned to see a new figure emerging from the shadows. It was an Apache warrior, but clearly not one of Neshoba's men. This man was younger, his clothes torn and dirty, his face marked with the desperation of someone who had been running for his life. Bitter wind. Chief Neshoba said, his voice heavy with disgust and recognition. I should have known you would be involved in this somehow. The newcomer was being forced down into the canyon by 3 of Neshoba's warriors, his hands bound behind his back with leather thongs. He was clearly Apache with long black hair and traditional clothing, but his eyes held a wildness that spoke of a man who had lost his way and his honor. You know this man? Sheriff Porter asked, his voice tight with suspicion. I know him. Neshoba replied grimly, his voice carrying the weight of long disappointment. He was cast out from our tribe 5 years ago for his violence and treachery. He tried to murder his own brother over a woman, and when that failed, he turned to theft and selling information to our enemies. The Apache chief reached into his leather pouch and withdrew something that made his warriors nod in grim recognition. It was a piece of cloth, but not the kind that had been presented as evidence against Thomas Merik. This was different, darker, with a pattern of beads and intricate stitching that marked it as traditional Apache work. My scouts found this at the scene of the raid. Neshoba continued, holding the cloth up for all to see. It was hidden beneath rocks near the water trough, as if someone had tried to bury it, but did not have time to complete the task properly. The pattern was distinctive and unmistakable. A series of geometric designs worked in blue and white beads, with a border of small silver discs that caught the sunlight and reflected it in brilliant flashes. It was clearly the work of a skilled craftsman, and just as clearly Apache in origin. This is from a medicine bag. Neshoba explained, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. Each one is unique, made by a warrior's mother or wife, according to ancient traditions. This particular bag belonged to Bitter Wind before he was exiled from our people for his crimes. The implications of the discovery sent a shockwave through both groups of men. If Bitter Wind had been at the scene of the raid, if he had been the one to steal the cattle and murder the ranch hands, then everything they believed about the crime was wrong. Search him thoroughly. Neshoba commanded, and his warriors began to methodically examine their prisoner. They found a leather pouch hidden in his clothes, heavy with coins and containing several folded pieces of paper. $50 in gold. One of the warriors reported, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence, and letters written in English. Neshoba took the letters and unfolded them carefully, his weathered face growing darker as he read each one. The silence stretched endlessly. As he studied the contents, his expression becoming more grave with each passing moment. Written in English. He said finally, his voice carrying across the canyon like a death sentence. Signed by Hoyt Sullivan. The silence that followed was so complete that everyone could hear the whisper of wind through the canyon walls and the nervous shifting of horses. Sullivan's face had gone completely white beneath his tan, and his hands were visibly trembling as he reached for his gun. That's impossible, he said, his voice cracking with strain. I've never seen this man before in my life. Those letters are forgeries planted to make me look guilty. Are they? Neshoba asked, his voice carrying quiet menace. He began to read from the first letter, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. Bitter Wind, The job is done exactly as we agreed. Hit the north pasture after midnight on the 15th. Make it look like a regular Apache raid, but leave evidence pointing to the white settlers. The farmer Thomas Merik has been asking too many questions about water rights and causing trouble for my plans. Frame him for the scouting work. When he hangs, his land will be available for purchase at the government auction. $50 now, 50 more when the deed is in my name and the water rights are transferred. The words fell into the canyon like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock and understanding through both groups of men. Several of Sullivan's own hands stepped away from their employer, their faces showing the dawning realization that they had been used as tools in a larger scheme. It's all lies, Sullivan said desperately, his voice rising to near hysteria. Forgeries and lies. You can't prove anything with fake documents. Bitter Wind, perhaps, seeing his only chance at survival, suddenly spoke up. His English was broken and heavily accented, but his words carried the unmistakable ring of desperate truth, not lies. He said, his voice hoarse from his flight through the desert. Sullivan came to me 3 months ago in the cantina in Santa Fe, when the moon was dark and the nights were cold. He knew my name, knew my shame, knew that I had been cast out from my people for my crimes. You're lying to save your own skin. Sullivan snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. No lies. Bitter Wind insisted, his voice growing stronger as he sensed the possibility of redemption. You bought me whiskey, much whiskey, and spoke of easy money. Said you needed Apache warrior to do special job for you. Pay very good money, $50 in gold, plus all the whiskey I could drink. What job? Chief Neshoba asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Kill ranch hands, steal cattle, make it look like Apache raid. Bitter Wind continued, his voice gaining momentum. But leave evidence to blame white farmer. You gave me knife cloth button. Told me exactly where to place them, exactly how to make it look convincing. Said the white man lived alone with only young daughter, would be easy to blame and hang. He paused, his breathing labored, then continued with growing desperation. You told me to hide the cattle in the canyon 5 miles north of here, the one with the hidden spring. Said after the farmer was dead, we would move them and sell them to buyers in California. Split the money between us. The confession struck the assembled men like a physical blow. Jake Morrison, his young face pale with horror, stepped forward with his gun drawn. Hoyt, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't have 6 innocent men killed for a piece of land. Sullivan's response was to draw his own gun and point it at the young cowboy. It was a good plan. He said, his voice cold and steady despite the desperation in his eyes. It would have worked perfectly if this damn kid hadn't interfered with her questions and doubts. A good plan. Lily's voice was small but clear in the charged atmosphere. You killed innocent people. You were going to kill my father. For what? For land and water. For the future. Sullivan replied, his eyes wild with the desperation of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. For the best grazing land in the entire territory. For water rights that would make me the richest and most powerful man in 3 states. For an empire that would last for generations. Built on the blood of innocent men. Chief Neshoba said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. Built on necessity. Sullivan snarled, his voice rising to a shout. Built on the reality that this territory is changing, that it's going to become part of the United States soon, and when it does land, will be worth more than gold. Your father's farm controls the water that feeds half the valley. With it, I could build something that would really matter. And without it? Neshoba asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity. Without it, I'm just another rancher scratching out a living in the desert, Sullivan said bitterly. I've worked too hard and sacrificed too much to settle for mediocrity. I've earned the right to be more than ordinary. The gun in his hand was steady despite his emotional state, but his eyes were wild with a kind of desperation that made men capable of anything. But it's not too late. He continued his voice, taking on a manic edge. Merik still dies, and all of you die with him. I'll tell the territorial authorities that the Apache attacked us during the prisoner exchange. No witnesses, no evidence, no problems. You would kill a child to protect your secret. Neshoba asked, his voice heavy with disgust. I would kill anyone necessary to protect what's mine. Sullivan replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. I would kill everyone in this canyon if that's what it takes. That was when Lily Merrick proved that true courage had nothing to do with size or age or physical strength. She stepped between Sullivan's gun and her father, her small body serving as a human shield. If you want to kill him, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her dust-stained face, you'll have to kill me first, and I don't think you're brave enough to murder a child in cold blood. The confrontation might have continued indefinitely, but nature itself seemed to intervene in the cause of justice. The wind, which had been growing stronger throughout the morning, suddenly picked up with alarming intensity. Dark clouds of dust began to form on the eastern horizon, and the air itself seemed to thicken with approaching danger. Storm coming. One of the Apache warriors called out, his voice tight with concern. Big sandstorm from the east. We need to take shelter. But before anyone could react, the wall of dust and wind struck the canyon with the force of a runaway locomotive. The sandstorm hit without mercy, turning day into night in a matter of minutes, and filling the air with stinging particles that made breathing difficult and sight nearly impossible. Men stumbled blindly through the chaos, calling out to friends and allies, seeking shelter from the punishing assault of wind-driven sand. The temperature dropped dramatically as the sun was blotted out, and the howling wind made communication nearly impossible. Sullivan, his face wrapped in a bandana to filter the worst of the dust, moved through the storm with deadly purpose. The chaos provided perfect cover for what he had to do, eliminate the witnesses to his crimes, and salvage what he could from the wreckage of his plans. Morrison. He called out to his young employee, who was struggling to control his frightened horse. Take 3 men and circle around to the north. Don't let anyone escape in that direction. Morrison, barely able to see through the swirling dust, hesitated. Boss, maybe we should wait for the storm to pass. This is too dangerous. Now do what I tell you. Sullivan snarled, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind. Or you'll end up like the others. The threat was clear, and Morrison nodded reluctantly, signaling to 3 of the men nearest him. They disappeared into the storm, and their forms quickly swallowed by the brown wall of sand and wind. You 2. Sullivan commanded 2 more of his loyal followers. Watch the southern approach. Kill anyone who tries to run that way. The men nodded and moved off, their rifles ready despite the difficulty of seeing more than a few feet in any direction. Sullivan had chosen his allies well, men who owed him money from gambling debts, men who were too deeply involved in his schemes to back out. Now men who feared his power more than they feared their own consciences. But not all of his men were willing to follow him into cold-blooded murder. Several of the posse members, horrified by the revelations about the staged raid and the planned massacre, had already begun to slip away into the storm. They wanted no part of killing children and innocent farmers, regardless of the consequences to their own safety. Chief Neshoba, meanwhile, was organizing his own response to the crisis. The Apache had faced sandstorms before, knew how to move and fight in conditions that would paralyze less experienced fighters. More importantly, they knew every inch of the canyon and could navigate by feel and instinct. The Gray Wolf. He called to one of his most trusted lieutenants. Take 4 men and work your way around to the western rim. Use the storm as cover, but be careful not to get separated. These white men cannot see in this wind. Use that advantage against them. What about the girl and her father? Grey Wolf asked, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. Protect them with your lives. Neshoba replied, his voice carrying absolute authority. They have shown courage and honor in the face of death. We will not let them die for speaking the truth. The storm continued to intensify, and the canyon became a maze of swirling dust and deadly confusion. Visibility was reduced to mere feet, and the howling wind made it impossible to distinguish friend from foe. Men called out to each other in the darkness, their voices lost in the roar of the storm. Lily, separated from her father in the initial chaos, crawled blindly through the swirling dust toward the sound of his voice. Her shoulder throbbed where a bullet had grazed her during the first moments of the storm, and she could taste blood in her mouth from the sand that had found its way past her lips. The wound was not serious, but it burned like fire and reminded her of how close she had come to death. "Papa," she called out, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Papa, where are you?" The world had become a nightmare of noise and confusion, where every shadow might hide an enemy and every sound might signal the approach of death. She pressed herself against a boulder as a figure stumbled past his rifle, held ready, searching methodically for targets in the swirling chaos. That was when she heard it, a low whistle that sounded like the call of a desert bird. But no bird would be flying in this storm, and Lily recognized the sound as a signal. Someone was trying to communicate, and she had a feeling it might be help. Following the sound, she crept carefully through the swirling dust until she found herself face to face with one of Neshoba's warriors. The Apache man held a finger to his lips, then gestured for her to follow him. His face was painted with traditional markings, and his eyes held the calm confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Together, they moved through the storm like ghosts, avoiding Sullivan's men and working their way toward the center of the canyon where the confrontation had begun. The warriors seemed to know exactly where to step, exactly which rocks to avoid, as if the terrain was mapped perfectly in his mind. They found Thomas Merik huddled behind a large rock formation, his hands finally free from their bonds, but his face streaked with dust and blood from flying debris. When he saw his daughter, relief flooded his features quickly, followed by terror at the danger she was in. "Lily," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Thank God you're alive. But you shouldn't be here. It's too dangerous. I'm not leaving you again." Lily said firmly, her small body trembling but her voice steady. "Not ever again." A gunshot rang out through the storm, followed by a cry of pain. Someone had found a target in the swirling chaos, but whether it was friend or foe was impossible to tell. The sound was quickly swallowed by the wind, leaving only uncertainty and fear. "We need to end this," the Apache warrior said, his English heavily accented but urgent. "Sullivan's men are trying to kill everyone who heard the truth. Chief Neshoba has a plan, but we need to move quickly." Through the swirling dust, they could see shapes moving purposefully through the storm. These were Neshoba's warriors, using hand signals and whispered commands to coordinate their movements. They had surrounded Sullivan's remaining loyal followers, cutting off their escape routes and forcing them into an ever-tightening circle. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Using the storm as cover, the Apache would close in on Sullivan's position from multiple directions, forcing him and his men into a natural dead end where they would be surrounded and outnumbered. It was the kind of tactical maneuver that had made the Apache feared throughout the Southwest. But Sullivan was not going down without a fight. He had positioned himself near the center of the canyon, using the rocky terrain for cover, and was picking off targets with methodical precision. His rifle cracked regularly through the storm, and more than once they heard the sound of a bullet finding its mark. "He's trying to thin out our numbers," Thomas observed, his voice tight with fear. "Make it easier to escape when the storm passes." He will not escape. The Apache warrior replied grimly. Chief Neshoba has sworn it. Too much blood has been spilled for him to walk away. As if summoned by his words, a figure emerged from the swirling dust, Chief Neshoba himself, his weathered face set with grim determination. Blood seeped from a wound in his arm, but his eyes were clear and focused. It ends now, he said simply, his voice carrying clearly despite the storm. Sullivan has chosen his path. Now he must face the consequences. The final confrontation began when Sullivan, realizing he was surrounded, made a desperate break for the canyon rim. He moved with the reckless courage of a man who had nothing left to lose, firing wildly at anything that moved in the swirling dust. You can't stop me, he screamed, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. I've worked too hard to let it all end here. But as he reached the rocky slope that would take him to safety, a shadow detached itself from the canyon wall. It was Bitter Wind, his hands somehow freed from their bonds, a sharp piece of flint gripped in his fists. The exiled Apache's face was twisted with something that might have been remorse or hatred for the man who had corrupted him. You made me betray my own people. Bitter Wind said, his voice carrying clearly through the storm. You made me kill innocent men for your greed. You made me into something I never wanted to be. Sullivan spun around his rifle, swinging toward this new threat, but it was too late. Bitter Wind had worked his bonds loose against the sharp edges of the canyon rock, and now he brought the flint down with all his strength. Sullivan's rifle discharged harmlessly into the air as he crumpled to the ground, his dreams of empire ending in dust and blood. But the random shot struck Chief Neshoba in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him to his knees. The Apache chief's weathered face was pale with pain and blood loss, but his eyes remained clear and focused on the task at hand. Enough, he said, his voice carrying clearly despite his wound. Let there be no more killing. Let there be no more blood spilled in this place of sorrow. The storm began to clear as suddenly as it had come, the wind dying down and the dust settling to reveal the full scope of the confrontation. Bodies lay scattered across the canyon floor, Sullivan's men who had died in the fighting Apache warriors, who had given their lives to protect the innocent, and Jake Morrison, the young cowboy, who had finally found his courage but paid for it with his life. Sullivan lay unconscious beside a boulder, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. His carefully planned scheme had ended in failure, his empire reduced to dust and ashes. The man who had wanted to rule the territory lay defeated by the very people he had sought to manipulate and destroy. As the dust settled, Federal Marshal Samuel Hayes arrived with a group of deputies, their badges glinting in the returning sunlight. They had been tracking Sullivan for months, following reports of land fraud and cattle rustling that had reached them from multiple sources. "Ni Hoyt Sullivan," Hayes said, looking down at the unconscious rancher with grim satisfaction. "We've been wanting to have a long conversation with you for quite some time. You've been investigating him." Sheriff Porter asked, his voice shaking with the realization of how close they had all come to participating in a lynching. "For the past 6 months. Hayes replied, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "We've had reports of intimidation fraud and suspicious land acquisitions throughout the territory. This attempted frame-up is just the latest in a long pattern of criminal behavior." As Sullivan was loaded into a wagon for transport to the territorial capital, he regained consciousness long enough to look up at Lily with eyes that held no trace of the arrogance that had once defined him. "You should have let me succeed," he said, his voice barely audible. "I could have built something great here, something that would have lasted for generations. Instead, you've destroyed everything. Built on blood and lies." Lily asked, her voice filled with sadness rather than anger. "That's not greatness, Mr. Sullivan. That's just destruction with a fancy name." 3 months later, the trial of Hoyt Sullivan became the most talked-about event in the territorial capital's history. The courthouse was packed with spectators who had come from hundreds of miles away to witness the final act of a drama that had captivated the entire Southwest. Newspaper reporters from as far away as St. Louis and New York had traveled to cover the proceedings, and the story of the 12-year-old girl who had prevented a war was becoming legend throughout the American West. Lily Merrick, now 13, and having grown noticeably in the months since the confrontation, testified with the same courage and clarity that had saved her father's life. She spoke simply and directly about the events in the canyon, never embellishing or exaggerating, but painting a picture of greed, deception, and violence that moved many in the courtroom to tears. "Your Honor," she said in her closing statement, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "I don't want Mr. Sullivan to die. I don't want him to suffer the way he made others suffer. I want him to live and think about what he did. I want him to remember the men who died because of his greed, and I want him to have the chance to become a better person than he was." Sullivan, who had remained largely silent throughout the trial, finally spoke when given the opportunity to address the court. "The girl is right," he said, his voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. "I became so focused on building an empire that I forgot what it meant to be human. I let greed corrupt my soul, and innocent men died because of my choices." The judge, moved by the testimony and the obvious remorse of the defendant, sentenced Sullivan to life in prison rather than death. The court recognizes that while the defendant's crimes were serious and resulted in multiple deaths, there appears to be genuine remorse and a desire for redemption. He said, "Justice is best served by allowing the defendant to spend the rest of his life contemplating his crimes and their consequences." Bitter Wind, who had cooperated fully with the authorities and shown genuine remorse for his actions, received a lighter sentence. He was ordered to serve 10 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 5 years if he continued to show good behavior and genuine rehabilitation. But perhaps the most important outcome of the trial was the formal peace treaty signed between the Apache Nation and the territorial government. The events in the canyon had shown both sides that their real enemies were not each other, but those who would profit from hatred and conflict between their peoples. We have learned that our survival depends not on defeating each other, but on standing together against those who would destroy us both. Chief Neshoba said at the treaty signing ceremony, his shoulder fully healed and his voice strong with conviction. "We have learned that wisdom is more powerful than weapons, and that justice is more important than revenge." The treaty established clear boundaries between Apache and settler lands, created trading posts where both peoples could exchange goods peacefully, and set up a monthly council with representatives from both communities to resolve disputes before they could escalate into violence. It became a model for similar agreements throughout the West, helping to prevent the kind of catastrophic wars that had devastated other regions. The stolen cattle were recovered from the hidden canyon, where Bitter Wind had revealed they were being held exactly 5 miles north of the confrontation site. They were returned to their rightful owners, and Sullivan's vast ranch holdings were sold to pay restitution to the families of the men who had died in the raid. As the years passed, Lily Merrick fulfilled her childhood dream of becoming a lawyer, though the path was difficult for a woman in the male-dominated legal profession of the late 19th century. She studied law through correspondence courses and apprenticed with sympathetic attorneys, eventually becoming one of the first female lawyers to practice in the territory. Her specialty was defending the innocent and the powerless people, who, like her father, had been falsely accused or victimized by those with greater wealth and influence. She never forgot the lessons she had learned in that canyon, and she carried the memory of Chief Neshoba's sacrifice with her always. Thomas Merik lived to see his daughter become a respected member of the legal profession, and he took great pride in her accomplishments. He continued to work his small farm, but he also became something of a local leader, helping to mediate disputes and serving as a voice of reason in the growing community. Chief Neshoba Red Elk lived to be nearly 80 years old, spending his final years as a revered elder and peacemaker. The treaty he had helped negotiate brought unprecedented prosperity and stability to the region, and his wisdom influenced a generation of leaders on both sides of the cultural divide. In the canyon where it all began, a small monument was erected bearing the names of all who had died in the conflict, and a simple inscription, "In memory of those who died, and in honor of those who chose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and justice over revenge." The story of the prisoner's daughter who prevented a war became more than just a tale of individual heroism. It became a testament to the power of truth over deception, of courage over fear, and of the belief that even the smallest person can change the course of history when they refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice. And in the end, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all, not just that justice was served, but that it was served through the courage of a child who refused to let fear silence her voice when it mattered most. The legacy of that moment lived on in the laws that were passed, the treaties that were signed, and the lives that were saved by the precedent of choosing truth over convenience, peace over violence, and hope over despair.